He sat in the same corner booth every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, ordering black coffee and dry toast, never speaking to anyone except to say thank you to the waitress. The regulars at Murphy's Diner thought he was just another lonely old man with nowhere else to go. But when Officer Jake Martinez walked in that Tuesday morning and saw the faded tattoo on the man's wrist, everything changed. Welcome to Story with Jorge. Before we continue this powerful story of hidden service and unexpected recognition, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These moments matter. Murphy's Diner had been serving coffee and comfort food to the small town of Millbrook for over 40 years. The red vinyl booths were cracked, the coffee was strong, and the regulars knew each other's names. But nobody knew the old man in booth 7. He arrived like clockwork every morning at exactly 6 a.m., always wearing the same faded green jacket and worn jeans. His hair was gray, his face weathered, and his eyes held a quiet intensity that made people look away. He'd slide into the corner booth, back to the wall, eyes scanning the room out of habit. "Morning, Mr. Patterson," Sarah, the waitress, would say as she poured his coffee. "Morning," he'd reply softly. Never more than that. The town gossips had their theories. Retired factory worker, widower with no family, maybe a drifter who'd settled down. But Frank Patterson never volunteered information, and nobody pushed for it. He paid his bill, left a modest tip, and disappeared until the next morning. Officer Jake Martinez was new to Millbrook, fresh out of the police academy and assigned to the morning patrol. At 25, Jake was eager to prove himself, to connect with the community he was sworn to protect. He had heard about the quiet regular at Murphy's, but had never paid much attention. That Tuesday morning changed everything. Jake had stopped in for his usual coffee to go when he noticed the old man reaching across the table for the sugar. As Patterson's sleeve rode up, Jake caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold, a tattoo, faded but unmistakable. The distinctive wings and crossed rifles of a U.S. Army Ranger. But it wasn't just any Ranger tattoo. Jake's grandfather had been a Ranger, and he'd taught Jake to recognize the subtle differences. This wasn't a modern design. This was Vietnam era, and below it, partially visible, were numbers that made Jake's hands shake. 75th, the 75th Ranger Regiment, Vietnam, the deadliest, most elite fighting force of that war. Jake stood frozen, coffee cup halfway to his mouth, staring at a man he'd completely underestimated. Patterson caught him looking and slowly pulled his sleeve down, his eyes meeting Jake's with a warning that said, "Don't." But Jake couldn't let it go. He'd grown up on his grandfather's stories of Vietnam, of Rangers who went where others couldn't, who fought battles that never made the news. His grandfather had served with the 75th, had told him about men who came home and never spoke of what they'd done, carrying their service like a private burden. That afternoon, Jake did something he probably shouldn't have. He ran Patterson's name through the military database his department had access to. What he found made him sit back in his chair, stunned. Staff Sergeant Franklin D. Patterson, 75th Ranger Regiment, 3 tours in Vietnam, Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters. The citation for his Silver Star was still classified, but the basic facts were there. Night infiltration mission, November 1969, retrieved wounded soldiers under heavy fire, single-handedly held off enemy forces for 6 hours until extraction. A genuine American hero, sitting alone in a diner, forgotten by everyone. The next morning, Jake arrived at Murphy's earlier than usual. Patterson was already there, coffee steaming, toast untouched. Jake approached the booth slowly, respectfully. "Mr. Patterson, I'm Officer Martinez. Mind if I sit for a minute?" Patterson looked up, his eyes guarded. "Depends what you want, son," Jake slid into the booth across from him. I want to thank you. For what? For your service. For what you did in Vietnam. Patterson's jaw tightened. I don't know what you think you know, but Staff Sergeant Patterson, 75th Rangers, Silver Star recipient. Jake kept his voice low, respectful. My grandfather served too. He told me about men like you, men who did the impossible and never talked about it. For a long moment, Patterson said nothing. Then, quietly, your grandfather see action? 3 tours. He said the Rangers he knew were the finest soldiers he ever met, said they saved his life more than once. Patterson nodded slowly. Good men, the old-timers. They understood. Understood what? That some things are better left buried. But Jake wasn't ready to let it drop. Sir, with respect, maybe some things shouldn't be buried. Maybe this town should know who's been sitting among them all these years. Patterson's eyes flashed. Number. That's not how this works. I didn't do what I did for recognition. I did it because my brothers needed me. The ones who didn't make it home, they're the heroes. I'm just the one who got lucky. Jake leaned forward. Mr. Patterson, there's going to be a Veterans Day ceremony next week. The high school is honoring local veterans. Would you consider? No, the word came out firm, final. But Jake had planted a seed. Over the next few days, word began to spread quietly through Millbrook. Not gossip, not rumors, but careful, respectful sharing of truth. Jake had spoken to the VFW commander, who'd verified Patterson's service record. The high school principal learned about the Silver Star recipient living in their town. The mayor heard about the hero who'd been eating breakfast at Murphy's for years. Nobody approached Patterson directly. They understood somehow that this was a man who valued his privacy. But the atmosphere at Murphy's began to change. Sarah, the waitress, started lingering a bit longer at his table, refilling his coffee more often. The cook, a Vietnam veteran himself, would nod respectfully when he caught Patterson's eye. Other customers gave him space, but treated him with a deference that hadn't been there before. Patterson noticed. Of course he noticed. A man doesn't survive 3 tours in Vietnam without developing acute situational awareness. On Thursday morning, he arrived to find a small American flag pin beside his coffee cup. No note, no explanation. Sarah just smiled and walked away. Friday morning brought a handwritten letter from a local high school student working on a history project about Vietnam veterans. Dear Mr. Patterson, it began, I know you value your privacy, but I want you to know that learning about your service has inspired me to understand what sacrifice really means. Saturday morning, the VFW commander, an elderly man named Roy Chen, who'd served in Korea, sat down uninvited in Patterson's booth. Frank, he said simply, I know you don't want to fuss. But there's something you need to understand. That young officer, he didn't share your story to embarrass you. He shared it because this town needed to know. We needed to know that heroism looks like a quiet old man drinking coffee, not like the movies. Patterson stared into his coffee. Roy, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but nothing. You've been carrying this alone for 50 years. Maybe it's time to let us carry a little of it with you. That's when Patterson finally looked up, and Roy saw something he hadn't expected. Tears. You don't understand, Patterson whispered. I lost men over there. Good men. Better men than me. How do I stand up and get recognized when they're still in the ground in Vietnam? Roy reached across the table and placed his hand over Patterson's. Frank, those men didn't die so you could spend the rest of your life feeling guilty. They died so you could live. And living means accepting that you deserve respect, recognition, and community. The Veterans Day ceremony was held at Millbrook High School on a crisp November morning. The gymnasium was packed with families, students, and veterans from multiple generations. Jake Martinez was in uniform, standing at attention with other first responders. When they called for local veterans to stand and be recognized, dozens of men and women rose to their feet to applause, but one seat in the back remained occupied. Frank Patterson sat quietly, head down, as the ceremony continued around him. He'd come, but he couldn't bring himself to stand. Then something happened that no one had planned. Sarah from Murphy's Diner stood up in the audience, then Roy Chen from the VFW, then Jake Martinez. One by one, people who knew Patterson's story rose to their feet, not in recognition of themselves, but in tribute to the man who wouldn't stand for himself. The applause started slowly, then built as more people understood what was happening. They were standing for the quiet hero in the back row, the man who'd served with distinction and asked for nothing in return. Finally, with tears streaming down his face, Staff Sergeant Franklin Patterson stood up. The ovation lasted 5 minutes. Students who'd never heard of the 75th Rangers applauded an old man they'd never noticed. Teachers who'd served coffee to a hero without knowing it wiped away tears. And in that moment, Patterson understood something he'd forgotten in 50 years of solitude. Heroes don't always get to choose when they're recognized. Sometimes recognition chooses them. After the ceremony, Patterson didn't immediately leave. He stood near the back of the gymnasium as people approached him, not for autographs or photos, but for quiet handshakes and whispered thank yous. A teenage girl whose grandfather had died in Vietnam hugged him and said, "Thank you for bringing him home." A young Marine on leave saluted him with tears in his eyes. Jake Martinez was among the last to approach. "Mr. Patterson, I hope I did the right thing." Patterson gripped the young officer's hand firmly. "You did something I couldn't do for myself, son. You reminded me that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Sometimes it means letting people honor what you've done, even when you don't feel worthy of it." As the crowd dispersed, Patterson walked slowly toward the exit. But he wasn't alone anymore. Roy Chen walked beside him, along with Sarah from the diner, Jake Martinez, and a dozen other people who'd become more than neighbors. They'd become the community he'd forgotten he belonged to. The next morning at Murphy's Diner, Booth 7 looked the same as always. Red vinyl, cracked and worn. But when Frank Patterson slid in at 6 a.m. sharp, something had changed. Sarah brought his coffee without being asked, but this time she lingered. "How you doing this morning, Sergeant Patterson?" He looked up at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in decades, he smiled. "I'm doing just fine, Sarah. Just fine." At other tables, people nodded respectfully as he passed. The coffee tasted the same. The toast was still dry, but the silence that had surrounded Frank Patterson for 50 years had finally been broken. He'd learned something that morning that every veteran needs to know. You don't have to carry your service alone. Sometimes the greatest honor isn't in the medal or the ceremony. It's in the quiet recognition of a community that sees you, knows you, and stands with you. Some heroes wear their medals on their chest, others wear their scars in silence, but the greatest heroes are the ones who learn that they don't have to be silent forever. Staff Sergeant Franklin Patterson had finally come home. Not from Vietnam, he'd done that 50 years ago. He'd come home from the isolation that follows so many who serve, back to the community that had been waiting for him all along. And every morning at 6 a.m., in Booth 7 at Murphy's Diner, America remembers one of its quiet heroes over black coffee and dry toast. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones that make headlines. They're the ones that unfold quietly, one morning at a time, in the heart of small-town America, where heroes drink coffee and the community that loves them finally learns their names.